Imagine yourself in the future, say 10 years from now. Who is the person that you'll be then? Will you look the same, just a little bit older, or will you look completely different? Do you want to still be working at the same job? Or maybe you're hoping to have moved up to the C-suite by then. Recent research suggests that the way you think about your future self, about the person who you'll be in the future, has a broad influence on your thinking and on how you make decisions. Working with my colleague at Chicago Booth, Dan Bartels, we came up with a method for manipulating how connected people feel to their future self. We had some people read about all the reasons why their identity is likely to remain stable over time. We had other people read about all the reasons why their identity is likely to change. And we found that this difference matters a lot. People who are more connected, who think that their future self will be more like the person they are now, are more willing to invest in the future. This method for manipulating how people think about their future selves has been applied in a wide range of research, including some really profound questions, all the way to how people think about their inevitable death.
There's this old idea from Buddhism, and it also shows up in Western philosophy, that there really is no constant self that stays the same across time. And if that's true, the philosophers suggest, it should have these beneficial effects on the way we view our lives and our attitudes about things like death. And so we've been exploring empirically whether this is the case by manipulating how people think about the self and seeing the effects that it has, or whether it has the predicted effects on behavior, decision-making, and judgment. The item that we were particularly interested in was the sort of existential question that I'm frightened by the prospect of never thinking or experiencing anything again. And our prediction was that if you think the self changes a lot, then you should be less afraid of death in 10 years than if you think the self stays the same. But when we did the study, we didn't find that at all. So we led people to think that the self changed a lot. And then we asked them how anxious they were about the prospect of never thinking or experiencing anything again. And it made no difference whatsoever. It didn't make them any less anxious about future death. We started to theorize about why this might be, and currently our thought is that it's because when you think about something like death or some future experience, like some future pain, like getting a root canal, you're not thinking about your traits. You're just projecting yourself into the future and imagining yourself having an experience or imagining yourself dying. And your ideas about whether your traits have changed or not in the intervening 10 years has no effect on the way you project yourself into the future. And that's why we think that this manipulation is really having no effect on attitudes about death.
When it comes to big negative events, those seem really scary to us. And then once those events pass, they don't seem as scary. So rather than thinking about death, let's take it down a notch and think about pain. What kind of biases do people exhibit when they're thinking about pain in the future compared to pain in the past?
Philosopher Derek Parfit several years ago posed this thought experiment where the idea was that you had to have a painful surgery of some kind, and he asked people to kind of hypothetically imagine that you wake up in the hospital room one day and you talk to a nurse and ask the nurse whether you've had your surgery or not, and the nurse doesn't quite know. You could have been a patient who had this really painful surgery yesterday that lasted sort of longer than usual, or you could be a patient who's about to go into surgery tomorrow where you expect the surgery to be sort of routine and relatively short. And the thought experiment is, which state of the world do you hope is true? So we actually went ahead and tested this, and indeed, about 90% of participants confirm Parfit's intuition. Right? Almost everyone prefers that the surgery already be over and done with. We then asked, okay, so basically how much pain in the past would you be willing to endure in order to avoid, say, 2 hours of pain in the future? They say that there's some trade-off where on average people are willing to endure about 5.5 hours of past pain to avoid 2 hours of future pain. We ran a separate study that asked not about your own personal pain, but to imagine the personal pain of some other stranger whom you don't know. And unlike responses for the self, Here, participants were much more likely to say they were indifferent between someone else's past and future pain. And so in some ways, when evaluating others, people are sort of more kind of rational in the sense of minimizing the total amount of pain experienced for an individual. And if we're thinking about how we would ideally like to design the time course of our pain over our lifetime, if we had that superpower, it would probably be some rule like, well, I want to minimize total pain. That tends to be what people are actually doing when they're making these evaluations for other people, but when they're making the evaluations for themselves, they show this real sort of bias toward the future, and that they are willing to endure a lot more past pain to avoid future pain for themselves.
So it turns out that people are biased in favor of their future selves, but not so much when it comes to other people. Our future selves, the person we think we're going to be, is very real to us. It includes all our hopes and our potential. But we don't think that way when we think about other people. Recent research has demonstrated that this asymmetry in how we think about potential affects how we judge our own abilities right now compared to the abilities of others.
I was interested in why people are kind of bad at knowing themselves and how well they do, especially relative to other people. They often overestimate their abilities or their standing on particular traits. And we were interested in figuring out, is part of the reason why they do that because they are counting things that they think they will do but haven't quite done yet. We did things like approach people at tennis courts, and we asked them to think about how many players they typically play against who tend to beat them but aren't as good as they are, and also players that they tend to beat but that are better than they are, right? So places where there's those disconnects between overall ability and actual performance. And what we find is that people are much better able to think of that first category than the second one. They can think of people who tend to beat them but aren't as good as they are than vice versa. It turns out, especially in a game like tennis, input and output don't necessarily match. So, the shot that you think that you could make is not always the shot that you do make, right? So you tend to count things like, I meant to make that shot, or I would have made it if my shoelace hadn't come untied, that kind of thing. But for other people, you simply see their output and count that only. We think about the future a lot, right? We think about what we hope to do and intend to do, in short-term ways and long-term ways, and the future is always a presence. For other people, we can hear about their ideas of the future, but they don't have the same weight, right? That they aren't as vivid, they aren't as meaningful, they often aren't trustworthy, right? And so we don't give them credit for those thoughts, whereas we have them all the time, and they're just a part of who we are, right? They're ever present, and because of that, we count them in ways that maybe we shouldn't necessarily, but I think make sense as a human being and how we think.
Our potential and who we wish we would become in the future is already part of how we see ourselves now. Sarah Maluki, a doctoral student at Chicago Booth, has demonstrated that failure is the biggest challenge to our sense of a future self. When we think about good changes to ourselves, that's already part of who we think we'll be. That just confirms how we think of our future self and doesn't pose a threat. But when we think about the possibility of negative change in the future, that really disrupts this connection between our current self and our future self and makes us question the stability of our identity. Interestingly, this view that we ourselves are getting better over time affects how we see the world in general as well. We think of the world as getting better all the time by whatever definition of getting better we personally have.
We saw these books being written around the 2008 election that were basically saying, from both sides, Republicans saying, eventually in 40 years, the whole country is going to be Republican, and Democrats at the same time were writing books that basically said in 40 years, the entire country is going to be Democrat. And clearly those two things can't be totally true. So we were wondering, how can people so readily think that whatever they believe now, not only do other people think it now, but that somehow over time the world is going to kind of eventually see the light and eventually come around to them. So we call this the belief in a favorable future. So, we ask people, are you a Democrat? Are you a moderate? Are you a Republican? And we ask people, in 40 years, do you think the country's going to be more Democratic, more moderate, or more Republican? And it turns out that all of those groups think that in 40 years, America's going to be more like them. So Democrats think there's going to be a ton of Democrats, Republicans think there's going to be a ton of Republicans. But kind of interestingly, moderate people think the world's going to be more moderate. So it isn't just that people think things are going to go to the extremes. It really is that people think whatever they think, it's going to come around to them. What we're looking at now is to see if what that actually does, ironically, is it makes you less likely to do anything right now to support your party. Because think about a Democrat, why bother going to volunteer or vote for a Democrat if it doesn't really matter, because in the end everyone's going to be a Democrat anyway. Same on the Republican side, why bother giving money to a Republican candidate or going to volunteer or going to vote if in the end the world's just going to figure it out anyway? Well, what if I then tell you that in fact the trend over the last 40 years is in the opposite direction? And those are studies that we're running right now to try to figure out if it is the case that it makes you complacent to believe the world is coming around. If we tell you that in fact the world's headed in the wrong direction, does it make you less complacent than you are right now and more motivated to act?
The idea that the world is moving in the wrong direction could be really disruptive to our relationship to the future. We think of time as moving in one direction, forward, and that can make the future seem a lot more immediate than it actually is.
Sometimes events feel like they're very close, sort of right around the corner, and other times they feel very distant, right? They're ages away. And because time is this sort of abstract concept that's a little bit hard to get our heads around, what people typically do is ground their conception of time in more concrete metaphors, in particular in spatial metaphors. If people think about movement through time in the same way that they think about movement through space, then this could suggest an asymmetry in how close or far away past and future events feel. So the idea is if you feel as if you're moving forward through time, then the distance between now and any given point in the future is getting increasingly smaller, right? Whereas the distance between now and any given point in the past is sort of getting increasingly larger. And so we predicted that any given time point in the future might feel psychologically closer than its equivalent in the equidistant past. And so one study we did to test this idea was to ask undergraduates here at the University of Chicago to think about Valentine's Day. And what we found is that a week before Valentine's Day happened, people felt that it was sort of right around the corner. They thought, oh, Valentine's Day is really coming up pretty soon. It feels psychologically close. But the same amount of time after Valentine's Day, so 1 week after it happened, when we asked people to remember it, they seemed to report that it felt like ages away, right? They thought it was much more psychologically distant after it happened than before it happened. Some other researchers have looked at this idea that people will kind of strategically distance themselves from past selves that they don't really want to identify with. And that can actually be effective at motivating them to continue to preserve their positive self-image.
Thinking about the future and feeling more connected to the future self can provide important additional motivational benefits. If I feel connected to my future self, that gives me a motivation to help provide for that future self and to make far-sighted choices. So we find that people who are more connected to their future self are willing to endure painful medical procedures now if there is a long-term health benefit. We find that young people who are more connected to their future selves are less likely to be overweight. Among those who are overweight, they're more likely to do something about it. We tracked students' gym attendance over the course of a year, and we found that overweight students who were higher in connectedness visited the gym more often. Similarly, we did a study where we provided people with free snacks. Overweight participants who were more connected to their future self were more likely to choose lower calorie snacks as long as they were reminded to think about the health benefits. So the idea of a future self provides us with a new way of understanding how to motivate ourselves to act for a better future. If we define ourselves by those things that will remain stable over time and focus on what we have in common with our future self, that'll provide the motivation that we need to make those difficult choices that will benefit our future.